as a novice, a real beginner. My interest in the subject did not begin until last October. Prior to that time, I had very limited knowledge of the DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or I'll just abbreviate it as North Korea. I did have some knowledge of the Korean War. I read my first book on the Korean War when I was 12 years old. For those who want more specific references, when I was 12, it was the second year of the Korean War in 1951. But after that, my interest was kind of secondary, or even tertiary. Now, I was interested in ideologies in other countries, such as China, Soviet Union, and so forth. And come last October, I happened to come across some stuff about the ideology in North Korea. I thought, damn, that's interesting. Because I first came across what was called Songun, S-O-N-G-U-N, which is military first ideology. So, geez, military first? I mean, war in the military is my field. So maybe I should examine this a little bit more. And that's how I got into it in last October. Now, since then, I've read exactly 20 books on the subject. Plus, I don't know how many articles. That does not make me well informed by my criteria. 20 books plus at least twice as many articles in that short amount of time is a lot of information. And I need, if I read that much, I need at least a year to process it. Okay? So it's not really processed or synthesized yet. As might be apparent by some of the things that I say or don't say. And on the subject of North Korea, the views are so diametrically opposed. The information tends to be so sparse compared to other countries, at least the ones that I've studied, that it's a daunting task to actually come to some kind of reasonable conclusion. I read things that were completely opposed and those that were positive, totally positive. I tried, the majority were kind of in between. Okay? I liked information-based, fact-based material. Those that are opposed uniformly saw nothing good in North Korea, and even what they thought was good was they attributed to malicious reasons. Those who saw nothing bad in North Korea, right? Well, you could find nothing negative. Literally nothing. So that left, that left me in a, how should I say, in a quandary in certain respects. Also, aside from not much information, there's a lot of legend, or we might call myth, about North Korea. Its origin, its development, its leadership. The advantage, however, is that these legends are within living memory. And so that there are recent historical documents which can relate to those legends. For example, documents that were found in the Soviet archives, Chinese archives, in the Japanese archives, in even in the US archives of material that was captured when the US took over Pyongyang during the Korean War.
Pyongyang, did you say?
Yeah.
Where is it?
Capital.
Thanks.
So, all that being said, in preface, let me get to the substance. We'll start off with Kim Il-sung, who we might say was the founder and first leader of the DPRK. He was born in 1912. He was born in Korea of Christian parents. His father was a pharmacist. Shortly after he was born, they went to what was then called Manchuria, right, northeast China, where a lot of Koreans had fled because of the Japanese occupation of Korea.
About what year?
What year?
About what year?
From about 1875 up to 1945. Now, when he went to China with his parents, he went to school there in a Chinese-speaking school. So he became fluent in Chinese. And he spent a short time with his uncle back in Korea, going to school for, excuse me, a couple of years. But most of his education was in China. When he was a mid-teen, he left school and became involved in student political activities, eventually with the Communist Party, or Communist Party youth groups. And he became prominent as a guerrilla leader. He made a couple of speeches which are noteworthy. One in 1930, in which he made a certain conclusion which lasted throughout his life and which impacted Korea up until today. And that is, in this 1930 speech, he said that the reason why in the 5,000-year history of Korea, it had largely been either under Chinese tutelage or under Japanese control was that it had been militarily weak. And the only way that it could become strong is essentially by picking up the gun and not losing the gun. In 1931, he made another talk in which he said the only way to overcome the Japanese was through guerrilla warfare. And he laid out a general strategy for this to happen. Well, throughout the 30s, one of the things that's not mentioned in official Korean history is that he was part of the Chinese army. in official Korean history, he was in the Korean Revolutionary Army. This really never existed until after he returned to Korea. He was actually part of the 11th Route Army of the Chinese Red Army. He was part of the chain of command of the Chinese Red Army. Not an independent organization. There were Korean guerrilla groups, okay? But they were under the direct control of the Chinese army. You might say they were a unit of the Chinese army. Okay? Well, during his fight, during the 1930s, he engaged in some notable battles, which led him to be put on the Japanese hit list. And some Korean collaborators with the Japanese were charged with chasing after him. And towards the end of the 1930s, his forces had diminished quite a bit and it was hard to get recruits. And by 1941, he crossed over into the Soviet border. Okay? He was in the Soviet Union from 1941 to 1945. While he was in the Soviet Union, he was in the 88th Special Brigade. The 88th Special Brigade was a Soviet unit made up of Chinese and Koreans. They did very little fighting. They were mainly concerned with being prepared for the post-war scene of occupation, of having natives of China and Korea to go back to those countries after the war. The only military things that they did was reconnaissance. So there was some reconnaissance into China, for example. While he was in the Soviet Union, he was, of course, made then a member of the Soviet Army. Eventually became a captain. He went to infantry school. He studied primarily the works of Stalin, which played a major political influence in his life. Two major things that he did study was Stalin's work on the history of the Bolshevik Party, and secondly, the foundations of Leninism. So his Marxism tended to be kind of limited. He had no, as far as we can tell, no extensive study, of, if any, of Marx or Engels directly. So the Soviets liberated Korea, at least the northern part of Korea. And a week, or a month, about a month, 3 weeks to a month after the liberation, Kim Il-sung landed in Korea off of a Soviet warship in the Soviet Army officer's uniform with the rank of captain. Accompanying him were some of his comrades who had fought in China. Now this, he was sent there initially to to facilitate communications between the Soviets and the Koreans.
Sent by whom?
By the Soviets. Through a process of, how should I say, a relatively quick process, he was presented to the Korean public by the Soviets in a major talk in 1945, late 45. And from then on was tutored by the Soviets, by two Soviets in particular, two Soviet officers, and guided, guided into leading position within North Korea. It was a process, an interesting process, but I don't have time to go through it. Okay. So there were, at this time in 1945 on, at least until the late 50s, there were four factions in North Korea. But before I go into that, let me just say one thing about North Korea, South Korea. Okay. The day after Nagasaki, Dean Rusk drew a line across the 38th parallel and said, north of the 38th parallel, Soviets, south is ours. That's how the division became. Now, this was not recognized actually in Korea, neither by the North nor the South, initially, for a long time. Okay? It became two different states along that parallel later. Okay? But it was a creation of the United States. Okay, so four factions within the North. There was the partisan faction of Kim Il-sung and his comrades who had fought in northwest China, northeast China, pardon me, in Manchuria. There was second, there was a Chinese Korean faction that had fought with Mao, okay, who were in the 8th Route Army, which was Mao's, which became Mao's Red Army. The third group were indigenous Korean Communist Party members, okay, who had been in Korea since the Soviet Revolution. Okay, it was a very weak group by the end of World War II. They'd been pretty well decimated. Many had been in jail. Many had been killed. Okay. But there were survivors, and they were in the North. And lastly, there were Soviet Koreans. Beginning in the early 1800s, Koreans began to move to the Soviet Union. Okay, so by 1945, there were several 100,000 Soviet Koreans. And there still are, of course. Just like there are Korean Chinese, or Chinese Koreans, however you look at it. The Soviet Koreans initially played a major role in the North. That is, they were the ones who were the tutors for the formation of the Communist Party. They ran the Communist Party newspaper. They were in command of a lot of different organizations within the North. They were the chief Soviet advisors in the North. Now, by the late 1950s, all these groups, except for the partisans of Kim Il-sung, were either purged from the party or were put in secondary positions. the party as such, by then under Kim Il-sung, and now I'm talking about by the 1946, proceeded on the Soviet model, that is, the Soviet model under Stalin, of rapid state ownership of industry, rapid collectivization of agriculture. So that by 1947, 72% of industry and agriculture were either under state or collective ownership. By 1958, 99.9% of industry and agriculture was under state or collective ownership. Now, we come to the Korean War. And as you'll see, I'm jumping around very quickly, okay? In the Korean War, in looking at it as thoroughly as I can so far, I've come to the conclusion that it was a civil war. A civil war. The time Koreans, North and South, really didn't recognize two different states. Okay? The 38th parallel was just a line on a map that didn't have any meaning. It's just like if the line between the North and the South, the Mason-Dixon line, didn't have any meaning. You know, I mean, those in the South, hey, they're ready to move into the North. Those in the North ready to move in and take over the South. I mean, you know, it was a civil war, right? So, those in the North wanted to liberate the South. Those in the South wanted to liberate the North. Okay? And they were pushing on the respective occupying groups for that to happen. In the South, if you read in Bruce Cummings' book, which is probably one of the best I've read on the Korean War, I think he wrote 3 or 4 volumes on it. I only read one, the smallest. He describes CIA reports of how they're trying to stop the South Koreans from invading the North. And they're trying to, don't do it, don't do it. Only if you can find an excuse like the North moving to the South should you actually do it. Otherwise, it'll look bad for you and look bad for us of supporting you. So there was this conflict there, and there was also a great push in the North for liberation of the whole country. By 1946, there were skirmishes along the 38th parallel. By 1947, there were movements from the South into the North. By 1949, one of the bigger movements from the South into the North was a battle in the North of Southern forces who moved into a little peninsula area in the North and fought a battle for several days. So when the North went to the South on June 25th, and I believe that was the case, to them it was just the same ideology of liberation that the South had for going north of the 38th parallel. That's why it was a civil war. It wasn't a war between different states, it was a war between Koreans. The US did not have troops in South Korea. They had advisors. Yeah, and there was a definite difference. U.S. troops did not enter until the first week of July, and the first troops to come in, the 24th Infantry Division, were occupation troops from Japan, which is essentially to say a bunch of guys that drank a lot, partied a lot, did light duty, had very little training, comparatively speaking, to those who were stateside, who were not well equipped. Okay? On the other hand, the North Koreans had been equipped with the latest Soviet equipment. Many of them had fought in the Chinese Civil War, right? And you know, the Chinese Civil War ended in 49, the Korean War began in 50. These guys came into Korea, battle hardened. Yeah. And it wasn't surprising that they moved very swiftly from the 38th parallel all the way down to the Pusan perimeter, okay, in South Korea. They were just, how should I say, just a better prepared army and a more experienced army than the U.S.
The people from the north moved into the south,
Yeah.
conquering. Where's Pusan? How far south?
It's on the southwest corner
Okay.
of Korea, at the very bottom,
Oh.
very southwest. The Koreans, I don't want to go into the Korean War in detail, but generally speaking, the Koreans and also the Chinese had an envelopment strategy, which essentially they got from the Soviet military doctrine. As the Soviets trained the Koreans, the Soviets had advisors, military advisors in Korea, okay? And the idea was to circle the American and later the UN troops, right? And to attack them from the sides and the front, and to prevent them from retreating. Okay, they used that tactic a lot, especially during the first year and a half. Eventually, of course, the UN troops got wind of the tactics. Well, let me jump ahead. The UN troops landed in Incheon behind the North Korean lines. That is, Incheon was near Seoul. Okay, trapped the North Koreans. Okay, and that changed the character of the war. So that afterwards, that's when they began to move up north into North Korea. And when the Chinese came in October of 1950, and pushed back south of the 38th parallel eventually, and that's where the war stalemated. By that time, I'm talking about now by the late 1951, by that time the UN forces had caught on to the tactics of China and North Korea, and a stalemate ensued, with the North Koreans trying to push back to get as much territory as they could, and the Chinese more concerned with how many UN troops that they could decimate. Okay. But it pretty much stayed like that until the armistice in 1953. Okay. Now, let me get into the first ideology that I want to talk about. Juche. Juche. Juche.
How is that?
Juche.
It means, popularly called self-reliance. This is developed by Kim Il-sung and first announced in 1955. it developed. And I'll go into a little bit of detail on it in a second. But as it developed, especially in the 1960s, this ideology of self-reliance began to become more prominent in relationship to Marxism-Leninism. Marxism and Leninism up to that time had been the dominant ideology of the Korean Workers' Party, the Communist Party in Korea. Right? But when Juche came up, okay, it started like, here's ML, Marxism-Leninism, here's Juche, okay? By 1950, this right here. Okay, by 1972 Constitution, here's Marxism-Leninism, here's Juche. By the 1972, by the 1992 Constitution, here's Juche. Marxism-Leninism, nowhere to be found.
You mean influence or?